As geopolitical issues become part of boardroom conversations, a deeper understanding of China's economic landscape is no longer optional. China in the Changing Geoeconomic Landscape is a 4-week fully virtual course by Takshashila Institution on how China is reshaping trade, finance, and global power. You'll unpack China's rise, its economic model, de risking, trade as strategy, and Beijing's push to reform the global financial order. Applications close on 20th January 2026. Apply now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Have Southeast Asian economies truly gained from the China plus one shift, or are they just simply rerouting Chinese supply chains through new hubs? Let's discuss this question today and more. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by my colleague Bhumika, also from the Indo-Pacific Studies team. So just for some context, China plus one as a concept emerged way back around 2010, 2012 as companies sought to reduce their over-reliance on China amid rising costs and uncertainties in regulations. But really, it gained momentum during the 2018 US-China trade war, and the subsequent COVID-19 disruptions really accelerated this move, supporting China's zero COVID policy. And a good alternative was ASEAN. Why? ASEAN offered skilled labor, proximity, free trade access to the US. And this led to a lot of low-cost manufacturing. So we know this overhyped diversification, but Bhumika, coming to the first question, has this China plus one strategy, has it genuinely translated into long-term gains for the region, or is ASEAN simply a temporary shock absorber for US-China trade tensions?
Right. Thank you, first of all, Vanshika, for setting that context so well. So, the China plus one strategy, or let's just say the larger geopolitical upheavals that have come up recently, in general, they have turned out to be favorable for the Southeast Asian nations. And this is if we were to look at the growing investments in the region, the increasing participation of these economies in the global value chains of future technologies. But there are more factors at play in this as well, right? Other than the geopolitical shift. So why do we think that firms chose to redirect their investments in ASEAN nations over other developing or emerging economies? So let's just go over some of those factors first. So some of the other characteristics of the region that contributed to this redirection are its presence hitherto that in the supply chains, their contribution that they have made up until now in the supply chain, they have been a significant part of the electronics value chain in assembly and packaging up until now as well. Their geographic location, of course, gives them an advantage in shipping lanes. And then there are these low labor and capital costs. But lastly, there's another important factor that has contributed to these economies being attractive is the reforms that they've taken up both individually, but also collectively with the help of ASEAN as an organization. So the regional bloc has helped these nations benefit from the collective bargaining. And most of all, the economic integration that the region experiences is something that has been attractive to investors. The economic integration, the integrated production networks. So to your question, all of these factors have benefited some Southeast Asian nations more than others, of course. So there have been unequally distributed gains with respect to this redirection of in under the China plus one strategy. And it is dependent on both the nations and the bloc as a whole on how they continue this momentum in investments and value chain upgradation.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that one of the reasons for the attractiveness of the region was the reforms that they've taken up individually and collectively. So we'll come to those reforms in a bit. But before that, let's unpack the terror that was unleashed by the United States recently. And we've seen that the tariff rates for these economies have now converged around 19 to 20%. And yet countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, initially who were given really high tariffs, they've now struck very different concessions with the US. So on this, how important has the bloc's collective posture been in strengthening, their bargaining power? Because clearly they also have a lot of bilateral variations.
Right. So, as you mentioned, right, so their tariff rates started from somewhere about 40% for the countries. But for major Southeast Asian countries now, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore, they've come down to about 19 to 20%. But of course, there have been bilateral bargains that these countries have made with the US in their trade negotiations. So, Malaysia's bargain was that they'll include a rare earth cooperation clause with the United States. Thailand removed duties on 99% of US goods imports in the country. Then Cambodia again agreed to adopt some customs reforms. Of course, Thailand and Cambodia's recent peace deal that got signed, there was also a threat from the US that if they do not agree to a ceasefire, they will continue on the higher tariff rates instead of lowering them. So those were the individual bargains that the countries made. But apart from these benefits trickling down from the US China rivalry, ASEAN as a regional bloc also has dealt with the trade tensions really well, right? There are frameworks like ASEAN Plus 3, there's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which they have been trying to push for decades. And I think those frameworks have come in really handy for the bloc now in these times. They have been useful in increasing trade and investments from China and other East Asian economies like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. Its position in the global value chains for electronics, automotive, and critical minerals and apparels have been upgraded with firms investing in more manufacturing plants in ASEAN economies under the China Plus One strategy. But the China ASEAN FTA as well was recently upgraded in after the October 2025 summit. So it has also emerged as an important region in fulfilling the demand for technological products in the Western markets. The US and the EU are accounting for both higher exports as well as greater FDI inflows. So there have been bilateral talks for bringing down tariffs, but then again, systems like ASEAN single window system has benefited China in successfully redirecting its trade to the US while also resulting larger value added in supply chains for ASEAN nations. So the single window system, I think, can be an effective way going ahead for ASEAN to deal with stricter rules of origin requirements and sort of rule out rerouting of Chinese goods that do not add any value to the ASEAN economy. So it is frameworks like these that ASEAN as an organization has carried out that has helped the member countries in sort of gaining a larger share of trade and investments. So again, some strategies like this resulted in a trade surge with the US for ASEAN nations, with total goods trade reaching $476 billion in 2024. According to there were also goods exports from Southeast Asia to the United States rose 25% between July and September compared with the same period in 2024. Meanwhile, shipments from China to the US were down 40% in the same period. However, when it comes to China, ASEAN is also the largest trading partner of China, with bilateral trade nearing $800 billion last year. But this is also due to the integrated manufacturing practices that existed before this between the two partners. Apart from the bilateral efforts of countries in signing trade deals with multiple partners, ASEAN's collective posture of non-interference by external powers in decision making. So I think that is also something that has shielded Southeast Asian nations from taking sides in this rivalry. So with the countries engaging with multiple countries, depending on the objectives of their frameworks of economic development, the bloc's focus on economic development is also what brought back the Trump administration's attention in the second term, right? So I think the economic centrality here is also very important.
Yeah, I think those were some interesting statistics. So, continuing on that, I think if we look at ASEAN's export profile, there are certain sectors that have now come to dominate that profile. So, you can expand on that as well. But also, what do you think is the cause of this? Is this the result of deliberate division of labor which was done regionally, or is it some sort of market-led clustering which was driven by MNCs when they started responding to China Plus One?
Right. So again, I think it could be a combination of both of these options, right? A couple of sectors that benefited are critical minerals, there's semiconductors, electrical machinery, and consumer electronics, especially. 6 to 7 major sectors accounted for more than 36% of total exports, highlighting, again, of course, their central role in both trade and investment. So between 2020 and 2023, ASEAN accounted for 26% of the global exports in critical minerals and 23% in semiconductor exports. But then this trade has also been sort of concentrated, right? So nearly 65% of exports were concentrated in 5 markets. And the United States, again, recorded the fastest growth in terms of exports, and it now absorbs about 15% of ASEAN's exports. And this growth in trade within the United States has mainly been focused on growth in the trade of consumer electronics, automotive, rubber, and semiconductors, and apparels as well. So, for trade with China, both imports from and exports to the country have significantly increased. So, more than 75% of critical mineral exports from ASEAN went to China. Of course, we know that a lot of extraction is done in Southeast Asian economies, but a lot of processing and refining happens in China. But then this only sort of increases the region's vulnerability to demand shocks through dependence on a single market, right? Not just on China, but the region as a whole is also dependent on the demand of Western markets. So that is another vulnerability for them. Apparel exports, again, were more concentrated. Nearly half of them went to the United States and the European Union. And while more than half of the apparel imports came from China. And surprisingly, Cambodia has acted as a significant sort of rerouter for Chinese apparels to the Western markets. But there's also a role of the regional comprehensive economic partnerships that has sort of accounted for nearly half of exports, emphasizing the importance of regional cooperation. And that is, again, another tool that ASEAN tried to use for diversifying their sort of trade. In terms of investments, again, 75% of investments, the FDI was absorbed by the services sector. And of course, because it was the services sector, most of it went to Singapore. But about 20% went to manufacturing in 2024. And within manufacturing, again, supply chain intensive industries and the digital economy played important roles. So electronics, electrical equipment turned out to be the most important sector. But then again, investment in sectors related to sort of clean technologies or climate technologies like renewable energy, those sectors which are reliant on international project finance, they saw a decrease in investments in this period. So as I mentioned earlier, that the gains in the China Plus One strategy have not been equal so far. So most investments went to Singapore, but the other countries that also accounted for investments here is Cambodia, Singapore, and Vietnam, which Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, which reached record levels. Looking at sources of FDI, while investments from China significantly increased, inflows from United States, again, halved in the year 2024.
Right. So, yeah, that tells me they have a very deep partnership with both the US and the China, and that too in different sectors. So, I think it's difficult for them to really choose. So, looking ahead, how do you think ASEAN is going to manage this rivalry? Is it going to be through, the collective bargaining, through internal reforms, or do you think that the more geopolitically volatile things become, the more that's going to undermine the region's, current flexibility and, the choices that it now avails?
Right. So there are different scenarios that can play out for ASEAN, right? If the geopolitical rivalry stiffens, of course, it's going to be more and more difficult for ASEAN to sort of continue this balancing game. So ASEAN's strategy of collective bargaining and reform-based hedging remains viable in the sort of near to medium term if the intensity of the conflict remains the same basis. But if the rivalry is again hardening into rigid economic blocs, further pushing tariffs or using such economic tools, ASEAN's flexibility will depend less on neutrality and more on how effectively it deepens regional integration and also how it integrates the region's economy with global value chains, sort of upgrading value addition across its economies. So the economic centrality, again, as I mentioned earlier, in the region is what will keep it in an advantageous position if the US-China relationship continues to worsen. And of course, internal reforms taken up by individual countries are also crucial to maintaining this centrality. This economic centrality, again, was something that sort of led to multinational firms choosing Southeast Asian nations over other developing economies in terms of redirecting their investments from China. But there are also limitations to this model. So as we've seen, there are unequal state capacities, and distribution of benefits from the bloc's activities also risk fragmentation. There are political events like the Myanmar crisis, there was the Thailand-Cambodia war, and China's tensions with the Philippines are factors that can build constant pressure on the organization to pick sides. But neutrality, again, is crucial in reaping the benefits in the larger geopolitical situation, especially if it continues to worsen. And again, especially with regards to China, because the region's economy is more dependent on Chinese inputs and investments than the Western markets. So improving trade volume with other partners like East Asian countries, and which again has been the trend in the period of 20 to 2024. And other developing economies will help reduce the region's vulnerability and dependence on the demand from the two largest markets for its exports.
Right. Yes, Bhumika. I think that was extremely enlightening, especially I think after the US tariffs this year. For a moment, or maybe for a good period of time, people thought that finally the edge that ASEAN had is also eroding, and it's sort of exposing all the, as you mentioned, the sort of transshipment vulnerabilities. And also then there were countries who were, prompting factories to, either eye India or Mexico next, to gain advantages. But I think overall we can conclude safely that for sure the China Plus One strategy has delivered a boom or a boost to the economy, to the regional economy. Maybe not transformational, as you said, because they've already been embedded in those existing supply chains. But I think to truly sort of continue this momentum and this win, they will need to continue building autonomous capacity. They cannot rely either on the US or the China in the long term. Otherwise, they'll keep being, becoming the next tariff target in this sort of endless game of supply chain. So thank you so much, Bhumika, for that conversation. And I hope our listeners enjoyed as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.